Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Terri Daniel, coming at you from Portland, Oregon, and very honored to be here today. We figured out that this is my third time talking to the Theosophical Society online. I've done a couple of in-person presentations over the years. And today I'm talking about mystical experiences of dying people who are dying. Most of my knowledge in this area comes from people in hospice because I am a hospice chaplain and also a hospice bereavement counselor. So I want to start with the definition of hospice chaplain because I know that as soon as you hear that word chaplain, most people immediately associated with the image of Father Mulcahy from MASH. Probably most of you are old enough to remember that image of a Catholic priest wearing a clerical collar and a Bible and a cross. That's what people think chaplains are. And that used to be true. But we are not your father's chaplain anymore. There's a whole new generation of chaplains, and we are and should be interfaith or interspiritual, we like to say. The idea of a chaplain at the bedside of a dying person or in any setting. There are prison chaplains, there are military chaplains, of course. Military is still pretty conservative. But we're trying to open that door to atheist chaplains and spiritual but not religious chaplains. But I'm going to just focus on hospice because that's where I work. The idea of chaplaincy is we walk into that room with that patient as a blank piece of paper. We do not bring our spiritual beliefs in with us. So I kind of want to lay that foundation before we start talking here today, because I had to train myself, very, very intensely because I always wanted to have shared death experiences with the patients. And we'll talk about what a shared death experience is a little bit later. And it is a discipline to not want to talk to them about near-death experiences and spirit guides and interdimensional communication and all the things that you and we in this particular audience are engaged with and find interesting. Similarly, if we were a different kind of audience, you might want to talk to them about Jesus and heaven and conversion. And of course, we're not supposed to do that. So chaplains are supposed to be religiously neutral. And that is a big issue in chaplaincy because without the proper training, if a hospice just hires a chaplain from the local church, the local pastor who hasn't had the specific kind of training that chaplains are supposed to have, they're going to come in there preaching and evangelizing and bad. We don't do that. Okay, so I just wanted to say that to start out. So let me introduce myself to you a little bit. I work for 2 hospices here in Portland as a chaplain and a grief counselor. I am also a teacher. I teach at 2 seminaries in the interspiritual chaplaincy program. My students come from every imaginable belief system. I have pagans, I have Muslims and Hindus and atheists and Buddhists, and I train them in the ways of chaplaincy. And I also teach in the thanatology program at Marian University. And if you don't know what thanatology is, it is basically the study of death, named after the Greek god Thanos, god of death. So I am steeped in death and the afterlife pretty much 24 hours a day in my waking life and in my sleeping and dreaming life. And I absolutely love doing this work. I started out as a hospice volunteer many years ago and quickly realized that I really wanted to have conversations with the patients about the mystical experiences they were having, because they were having them. They were talking about visitors to the bedside, their dead grandparents, their dead pets, and spouses were coming to visit. And I was all over that and really wanted to go into those conversations with them. But the way it works in hospice is that only the chaplains are really allowed to have those conversations with patients. And there's a reason for that. The reason is, again, you have to be trained to do that to protect from proselytizing. Because if anybody, any volunteer, any nurse, any staff member can get engaged in a conversation like that, you run the risk of Christian conversion and proselytization, and we really have to guard against that. So I learned very early that if I wanted to have these kinds of conversations with patients, I had to be a chaplain. So at 56 years old, I started college for the first time as an undergrad at 56 and got a degree in religious studies, then did a master's degree in pastoral care, and eventually a doctorate in pastoral counseling. Also, I could do this chaplaincy thing and eventually teaching. During those years, I started a little program called the Afterlife Conference. You can Google that. The conference ran in that form for about 11 years. And we had all the big presenters in afterlife research. You will know many of these names: Raymond Moody, Melvin Morse, Eben Alexander, Anita Morjani. And right after COVID hit and we couldn't have live conferences anymore, my research interests started to change. And I changed the format of that conference from the Afterlife Conference to the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief, because I was now working in hospice and doing grief counseling, and I was beginning to observe that people were really struggling with their inherited or embedded religious beliefs that they had carried with them from childhood, and that was interfering with them having a healthy grief process because of beliefs that they were carrying forward into their experience of a loved one's death and their experience of grief, beliefs like hell and punishment and guilt and shame and prayer. Why didn't my prayers work? I prayed for him to heal and he didn't. Why didn't God listen to me? Am I being punished? All those kinds of beliefs. And so that's what the conference is now. You can find that at deathgriefandbelief.com. And so that is the lens through which I look at this work now. So that's a little bit about my background. So what we're going to talk about today is end-of-life dreams and visions, which in the current research that wonderful researchers are doing today, it's abbreviated ELDV, End-of-Life Dreams and Visions. And the primary guy, two of them doing this research today, is Dr. Christopher Kerr at Hospice Buffalo in New York, and Dr. Sam Parnia, who I believe is at Stony Brook. We'll meet them in a little bit. So let me go back way, way, way back in history to primitive times, and interacting with spirits. And human beings have done this since the beginning of human life. And you can find examples of this pretty much everywhere. You can even find it in the Abrahamic trilogy in the Bible, talking to angels and animals, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, receiving divine guidance, talking to the dead. The experience of interacting with spirits, angels, is believed to mark the first human steps toward the development of religion. The other thing that leads toward the development of religion is to find a way to cope with loss. So here you are in your tribe, there's a flood or an earthquake or a volcano that kills people and wipes out all the crops, and you ask, why? Why did this happen? And you create meaning from this story. And you create the idea of gods or forces outside yourself that are creating these things. And so you find ways of interacting with those forces and hopefully influencing those forces so that they won't hurt you anymore, so that you won't have these losses. So you pray to these forces or you make sacrifices to these forces. And so that is also a way of interacting with spirits in a form to kind of co-create with them or interact with them to co-create. So that's kind of where all of that comes from historically. There's a lot of research on this, and one of the researchers who I really love, who also happens to be a very good friend of mine, is a man by the name of Gregory Shushan, and we'll talk to him a little bit about him a little bit later. And he looks at near-death experiences and extraordinary out-of-body experiences throughout history and across cultures. He has a book now called The World Beyond. I highly recommend it. And he has researched all over, going back probably 5,000 years, all these reports of these experiences. And I'm cross-referencing right now his work with another book called A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife by a guy named Mark Mirabello. And he pulls out some examples from ancient times, maybe not so ancient, but from indigenous cultures. In the Zulu tribe, they believe in reincarnation and that people can come back as animals. But only a chief can come back as a lion. So in Africa, obviously, lions are the most powerful animal understood to be ruling the roost. And so it would make sense that the chief would be the ruler. Now, where do they get this idea? Shushan explores this really interesting question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So let's look at the Zulu tribe. Does the idea come from somebody dies, appears to be dead, he is resuscitated somehow, or he wakes up and he comes back from the other world and he says to the people in the tribe, I went to the other world and I saw our chief who died last year. I saw him there and he was a lion. And everybody goes, wow, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And so that story gets folded into the legacy and into the traditions of the tribe, and it gets handed down through the generations that the chief comes back as a lion. And generations later, that is now the belief system. So now, generations later, 300 years later, whenever another person dies and he goes to the other world, and he sees his late chief also as a lion. So the research question is, does the experience come from having gone there and seen the lion, or having the belief about the lion and that's why you see it? Does it come from the cultural influence first or from the experience first? And we really don't have an answer to that. So that is, what we're always looking at. And what we do know is that our cultural experiences, our cultural influences do have an imprint on what we experience in near-death experiences. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me give you a couple of other examples from history. One Eskimo account says that he went to a village and there was meat cooking. So the place where he went looked just like his regular life. There are even accounts of Mormon near-death experiences where they went to a place where people lived in houses with plural marriages, with multiple wives and many children, just like physical life. Here is an account where a Winnebago shaman went to the spirit land and lived with an elderly couple for a period of time until he entered a womb and was born again, which is actually very similar to the Buddhist cosmology of after you die and you go through the 49 days of Bardo, and you go through a lot of experiences there where you encounter demons and projections of your traumas and hurts from your last incarnation and relationships that need to be healed and all your stuff that you're bringing with you between incarnations until ultimately you've dealt with all that in the bardo and you've cleared up things and you eventually see visions of earth that are very appealing to you. You kind of are drawn to the sensations of being in a physical body until you finally see a couple having sex and you go, oh, I remember that. That was pretty nice. And you're drawn to those two people and you're drawn to that energy and boom, you jump in and you get conceived. That is a Tibetan Buddhist idea. And similarly, this Winnebago shaman had something similar. Two very different cultures on the other side of the world never talk to each other. Somehow that's happening in another dimension. All right, here's another one. Swedenborg says that there's a temporary spirit world that ultimately leads to a heavenly or hellish community where we will have either pleasant faces or ugly faces. Okay, I already talked about the Buddhist bardo. A Peruvian shamanic tradition has an afterlife with three primary worlds: the plant world, the animal world, and the stone world. And the shamanic the shamans, the shamanic healers, can actually travel to these worlds and explore in there. And they sometimes do that to retrieve people in the afterlife that are not moving forward. They might be stuck in the stone world, and they help to retrieve them and move them forward. And so what is this showing us? This is showing us that there's all these different interpretations, and they're very much culturally influenced. Now, let me end this section with a quote from Shushan. So I'm just going to read this. This is from Gregory Shushan. I'm going to just quote him directly here. He says, "Religious beliefs about the afterlife are responsible for the content of NDEs and is to some degree an inversion of what the cross-cultural evidence tells us, that many cultures around the world have incorporated NDEs or elements of them into their belief systems. In my recent book, I found over 40 examples from indigenous societies alone, stating overtly that their culture's afterlife beliefs arose from the experiences of individuals who evidently died and returned to life. This is reflected on the microcosmic level by the many reports throughout history in which individuals changed their beliefs as the result of their NDEs. And this is one of the most consistently reported features of the phenomenon." Okay, so those are NDEs. One of the reasons that we don't have enough research on this phenomena is because people don't report it. And the reason they don't report it, if people are in the hospital and they are having these visions, I know that I'm mostly talking about NDEs right now instead of deathbed visions. But even in hospitals or in clinical settings, people don't report this because in many hospitals, in many settings, they would look like they are psychotic. And sadly, and I talked about this the last time I did a talk for your group, and so I apologize if you've all heard this before, but in the psychiatric world, we have a book called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, I believe it's called. And there's actually a section in it that defines certain mental disorders like schizophrenia, schizoid affective disorder, paranoid schizophrenic disorder, and all of this. And I did a little chart. I'm not the only person who's done this. Many people have done it, comparing what is experienced in these out-of-body journeys to the criteria for diagnosing somebody with a psychiatric disorder. So, for example, in an experience like this, where you leave your body and you experience perhaps enhanced cognitive abilities, an intensification of feelings, or a cosmic encounter with light, with God, or other manifestations of divine energy, or a recall of past lives or possible future events, visitations from dead relatives or other kinds of beings, or encountering a non-ordinary realm inhabited by other types of beings or relatives or friends or animals or beings of light, telepathic communication with these beings. Okay, that's pretty much sums up the kind of stuff that happens. Well, if you look at the DSM and you look at these experiences that I just described, they have a diagnosis to match pretty much every one of those things. A depersonalization disorder, where you have a sense of split self, where one part of the self is observing another. This is considered a mental disorder. Bizarre delusions, clearly implausible and not understandable to same culture peers. They do not derive from ordinary life experiences. Well, that's certainly true. Visual and audio hallucinations. Functioning, okay, functioning is not markedly impaired and behavior is not odd, but hallucinations are happening. It doesn't affect your behavior. You're not doing crazy things, but you're interacting with another world. And so this is considered a delusional theme that is not attributable to medication or anything else. And so this is how the medical community and the psychiatric community looks at these kinds of experiences. Okay, so now let's look at some new research. I just came across something wonderful the other day, a brand new piece of research that came out in the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, and it's a literature review. And in a literature review, what they do is they look at all the current research. In this case, they looked at 293 documents that did various studies on end-of-life dreams and visions. And from all of these, they synthesized it all down and found that 50 to 60% of hospice patients reported a visitation by someone who's not physically there while they dream or while they're awake. And they figured out how to separate it from delirium. Delirium is something else. Delirium is usually uncomfortable, categorized by anxiety and stress and discomfort, where these experiences are generally very peaceful and very enjoyable. So it's a little complicated to think of the terminology right now. Back in the 1970s, I'm kind of jumping ahead now, Raymond Moody, who was the original researcher on this, coined the term near-death experience. Sam Parnia, who is one of the current researchers, calls it after-death experience. And in this new study that I'm quoting right now, they're calling it an RED, recalled experience of death. Now, I've kind of left the dreams and visions world for a minute. I'm going back. Here's the thing about near-death experience. It has to do with the definition of death. The clinical definition of death has changed in recent years because of medical technology. Now, it used to be dead, was defined with the absence of breath and heartbeat. But now we can replicate breath and heartbeat by putting somebody on a ventilator. So we will have a person on a ventilator that appears to be alive. They have breath and heartbeat. So according to that old definition, they are not considered dead. So we actually had to change the definition of death, and the definition of death now is no brain activity. And that's where we get the term brain death. So that person on a ventilator can also have no brain activity, and they are technically dead, but their body looks like it's alive. So these experiences that we're calling near-death experiences happen when there's no brain activity. And that's why people who say, oh, it's just hallucinations, it's just the brain kind of sputtering out like the old tube televisions sputtering out just before they die, or your computer monitor. But it's not that because the brain's already dead. It's already flatline. So it's not happening in the physical brain. It's happening in the non-physical world. So I want to talk about some of these hospice experiences that people have had. So let me kind of move around here. I'm going to quote from this study that I just mentioned. People reported a lot of different kinds of content. They included encounters with both dead and living loved ones. So people might have just left their body and flown over to the home of a living person across town or across the world and visited them in spirit and said, I flew over to mom's house and I saw her cooking spaghetti. And sure enough, someone checks, and that's exactly what mom was doing at that time. Or they have visited, relatives who are on the other side. They have transcendental experiences, just like I described earlier, the kinds of experiences that are considered psychotic. They travel to different places. Sometimes they relive traumatic experiences and events. I'll get to that in a minute. The vast majority of these experiences depict encounters with loved ones. So here's a couple examples from people in the study. I was raking leaves in the back of the house, and my deceased husband came through the side yard. I asked him, "Where have you been for so long?" And he just said, "I'm sorry, I have to leave you for a while." Keyword, for a while. Here's another one. Barbara dreamed of her deceased father and brothers hugging her and welcoming her to the dead. They seemed to be preparing to go somewhere, but they didn't say where. Tim had dreams that included his deceased parents, grandparents, and old friends who were telling him that he would be okay. And these were people he hadn't seen for years. 3 days before another woman died, she reported experiencing both waking visions and dreams of being at the top of a staircase with her dead husband, waiting for her at the bottom of the staircase. And worthy to note in this study is the people in these visions were not intimidating or scary in any way. This was very comforting to people. So another subject said, "They never harm or frighten me. They're always smiling." There are a lot of encounters with pets when participants dream of deceased loved ones. It's often their dog. One person reported frequent dreams of playing with her childhood dog, Sparky. And she continued to have dreams of Sparky until she actually improved clinically and actually healed and came out of hospice. And then the dreams stopped. So Sparky came and helped her heal. Beautiful, very healthy. Okay, then there were also transcendental figures. In Kerr's study, Christopher Kerr, we'll talk about him in a minute, a participant was said to have dreamed of two babies among blue and white lights. And other people have described encounters with God, whatever that looks like and whatever that means. People described God held her hand, and she said, "I felt ready to die." People will describe, obviously, visiting Jesus. And I'm going to just pause in here right now and talk about the work of Melvin Morse back in the 70s. Melvin Morse and Raymond Moody were the big guys back in the 70s. They did the breakthrough work in this. Morse was a pediatrician, and he did a book called Closer to the Light. And his study was on the near-death experiences of children. So he worked at a hospital emergency room, I believe, and children would come in that were dying from illness or accidents, injuries, and he would resuscitate them. And they had been flatlined, and they would come back and they would talk about where they had been, and they were children, and they weren't afraid of going to the psych ward, and they would tell these incredible stories. Several of them would talk about Jesus and God because they had been oriented that way by their families. They had had religious orientation. And some of them who didn't have religious orientation, when he actually did the study, he would, make that part of the study, investigating their family culture. And what he found is the kids who had a religious family would go and sit on the lap of Jesus or walk hand in hand with Jesus. And the kids who didn't have religious orientation, sometimes they would see Disney characters. They would go walk with Mickey Mouse. These were really little kids. They were between like 3 and 7. One kid, this is my favorite, said, "I flew up into the sun and it hugged me." So this is the light. So this shows you how much the cultural input does influence these experiences. Okay, so I kind of diverted over there. Let's look at some of these other this other content. So one lady reported seeing 5 little angels in her room and told a priest she was ready to die and she wanted to write a letter to God. So this was obviously a Catholic person. She had a priest in her life and angels and God. There's her orientation. And, you know, the people who are dreaming of pets and the people who are dreaming of the light, they're bringing a different cultural orientation with them. Generally, emotionally, it's a cheerful, emotional tone, nothing fearful at all. It's meaning-making, and what they're finding and what Kerr found in most of his work. In Kerr's studies, 88.1 of the people in his study reported having at least one end-of-life mystical experience. 99% of them reported their experience as seeming real. 60.1% said their dreams were comforting, and 18% said they were distressing. And we'll talk about distressing in a minute. Let's look at more of what he said. As patients approached end of life, there was often an increase in the frequency of these dreams and visions. The most comforting ones were the ones that contained deceased loved ones. And if you look at the current research on what we call the tasks of mourning, now we're looking at grief and mourning for the people left behind, the loved ones after the person dies. And just as an aside, you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief. Forget everything you've ever heard. We don't use that. It's not a viable theory. Throw that out. Nobody uses that anymore. The reason it has survived and remains so popular in a short version is because a lot of people made money off of it. We don't use that anymore. We have the 7 bereavement themes. We have 4 tasks of mourning from Bill Warden. We have Rando's 6 R's. There's all these other models. We don't use the stages. But according to Warden's tasks of mourning, there are 4 tasks: accepting the loss, work through the pain of grief, adjust to the world without the loved one, and establish a continuing bond with the departed. Those are the 4 tasks that we do when we're grieving after somebody dies. Those are very important. You can look those up. Warden, Warden, 4 tasks. And so in Dr. Kerr's research, he found that the family members whose departed loved ones had these experiences on their deathbed were more accepting of the loss, were better able to work through the pain of grief, were better able to adjust to the world without the loved one, and felt that they had a stronger continuing bond with the loved one. I mean, think about it. If your spouse, your parent, your child was dying, and they said to you, "Hey, I had a dream that Sparky the dog or grandma or somebody or Jesus or whoever is meaningful to you came to me in a dream and told me everything is okay," wouldn't that make you feel better after they die and now you have to grieve and you know that somebody is with them or somebody is helping them? It's very helpful. So if you want to learn more about this, you can look up Dr. Kerr. It's just drchristopherkerr.com, and it's Dr. Dr. Christopher, Kerr.com. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about scary experiences. So, you know, if you are doing just casual research, looking around the internet and social media and YouTube, you're going to find a lot of content about, I died and went to hell, and I died and I saw Satan. There's plenty of stuff like that. And that does happen. And it happens because people carry their belief systems with them. So there was a very famous book. I can't remember what it's called. 12 Minutes in Heaven, maybe something like that. The guy who wrote it is an evangelical pastor, and he was in this terrible car accident and he died, and he had this hellish experience, and then he ended up with Jesus, and then he lived, and he wrote all these books about he went to hell and then Jesus rescued him from hell or something like that. What's happening is when you have a remembered death experience, a remembered experience of death, and RED. This is a new phrase, so I don't always remember it. You're not really moving in to the afterlife permanently. You're just stepping across the threshold for a minute. So you're only just, it's like walking into a house and you just open the door and step over the threshold, and then whoop, immediately you're pulled back. So you haven't had a chance to take off your coat and take off your shoes and shake off the snow where you're coming in from the cold. You still have your coat and the snow and the stuff on you. You haven't shed the stuff yet. So that's why you're bringing the stuff of your culture. That's why the little kids are bringing Jesus or Mickey Mouse or, the dog Sparky and all the stuff. Because and the visions of hell and all of that. You bring that with you because you're just inside the entryway of the afterlife, because you're not supposed to stay there. And then you're pulled back. And that is just kind of evidence that we carry all of that with you. And really, that's all I can say about these scary experiences. We have so much evidence of this. If you go to the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS, IANDS, that is basically the clearinghouse of all this information. Another wonderful story, one of the best ever, is from a guy named Peter Panagore, Panagore. He is also a good friend of mine. Google him. He died on an ice climbing trip. He was flatlined. He had an extraordinary near-death experience. But again, he was brought back. The thing that we don't have is what happens way past that point. What happens after we've been dead for 5 years or 5 months? And how do we get that information? So as far as I know, the only way that we get that information is through channelers and mediums. And interestingly, and I guess that's how I'm going to kind of wrap up this presentation, is most mediums and channelers, in the information that they collect, unfortunately, do not actually address this question, because they are consulted by people who are grieving, and people go to them and say, I want a message from my husband or my mother or my child who died. And that's where most of their focus is. So the medium or the channeler will bring in a message from a specific person. Very few people are going to these mediums and channelers and saying, I want to talk to my grandmother who died 30 years ago, and I want her to tell me where she is right now. What's she doing? Is she incarnated somewhere in the world? Is she still in the interlife somewhere? We have very little information about that. I can give you a couple of books. There's actually a book called Finding Galen, Galen, which is kind of a channeled book like that, channeled by a 17-year-old boy who died. apparently telling what day-to-day life is like in the afterlife where he is. There's also a very famous one called Nosso Lar, Nosssolar. They made a movie of it. You could actually find that on YouTube or Amazon. And that's an incredible story. That was channeled by a medium in Brazil and seems pretty realistic to me. So, very few sources for that kind of information. Okay. So, I want to just briefly go over who the researchers are now and where this research started. And I want to talk about going back to the Theosophical Society, as most of you probably know, back in the early 1900s. This was a very popular topic. Mediums were really not shunned and considered psychiatrically sick as much as they are now. And there were a lot of incredible books at the time. And there was a man by the name of Charles Leadbeater who wrote a book called The Astral Plane and another book called Invisible Helpers. And Invisible Helpers by Leadbeater, Leadbeater, can actually be found online as a PDF. And if you are interested in this topic, I highly recommend that you read this book. It is my absolute favorite book ever on this subject. It was published in 1922, all about interacting with beings and dimensions in other dimensions. And it was published by the Theosophical Society back in the 20s. So that is my book recommendation for all of you. And just briefly kind of looking at a history of the pioneers in this field, as I said before, Melvin Morse and Raymond Moody in the 1970s. Their books are Closer to the Light. That's the one about Melvin Morse's research, Resuscitating Children, and Raymond Moody's hugely famous book, Life After Life, where the term near-death experience was coined. Another guy by the name of Kenneth Ring, this was a while back, probably in the 80s, maybe late 70s. He worked with blind subjects. And 80% he studied 31 blind respondents, and they were able to see. They had visual visions of objects and persons who existed in the physical world and were able to see them in the non-physical world and describe them. Then more currently into the early 2000s at the University of Virginia, now there's a program called the Division of Perceptual Studies, run by Jim Tucker and Bruce Grayson. And they study near-death experiences, and they also have a program where they're studying children who report memories of previous lives. And then Pim van Lommel is in the Netherlands. He did a very famous study that is very well accepted by the medical establishment. It was published in Lancet. He studied 62 patients having cardiac arrest that reported all these interesting things. They had an awareness of being dead, 50% of them. 24% had an out-of-body experience. 31% experienced moving through a tunnel. 23% communicated with a light. 29% saw a celestial landscape. 32% met with deceased persons. 13% had a life review. And now for Sam Parnia. So he did in 2008, which was a while ago now, which was considered the world's largest near-death study, called the AWARE study, and the word AWARE is an acronym. This is the coolest study. Here's what he did. So he went into a big hospital, and I think he did this in England, USA, and Australia. And so imagine a hospital room, and you know the ceiling tiles, those like kind of white, soft tiles, and they have holes in them. They're little like 12 by 12 tiles. He took pieces of I don't know, cardboard or other tiles, and he suspended them from the tiles like this. And on top of those, he had pictures. I don't know if you can see this in my camera. He would have a picture of like a shoe or an apple or a dog. And he'd hang these from the ceiling. So the only way you could see the picture is if you were up here between the picture and the ceiling. And he hung these all over the hospital in the ER and the ICU and the critical care units for a year. And he studied all the people who had been resuscitated, and they were reporting seeing an apple and a shoe and a dog and the things that were on these panels. Absolutely amazing. So he's done other studies since then, and running out of time, so I can't go into detail, but definitely look him up, Sam Parnia, Parnia. And then, of course, Chris Kerr, who I've already talked about. I've told you his statistics already. He's at Hospice Buffalo. You can find him. And Gregory Shushan, who I mentioned also, who was doing the studies on these experiences across culture and across history. And I forgot to mention William Peters. He has something called the Shared Crossing Project, and you can find him at sharedcrossing.com. Also a friend of mine. This is really extraordinary. I have experienced this myself with my hospice patients, sitting with them as they are dying. This is something called a shared death experience, SDE, where you are sitting with someone who's dying and you can actually travel with them. And there are tools you can use where what I do is, and I have learned some of these tools in my training with shamanic practitioners, where you can actually synchronize your breathing with them. And it's kind of hard with the way that dying people breathe very irregularly, but sometimes you can do it. If you can put yourself into a very deeply meditative state and breathe exactly the way that they are breathing and try to connect with them telepathically, you can journey with them. You can feel the presence of their essence, of their spirit, and you can see what they see. You can feel what they feel. You can go where they go. I have had this experience once or twice. It's very rare. It's extraordinary. So to learn more about that, go take a look at William Peters. And I believe that is all. I'm going to end with a quote from Socrates that I love, which is, "No one knows whether death may not even turn out to be the greatest blessings of human beings. And yet people fear it as if they knew for certain that it is the greatest evil." So that is my talk. I am Dr. Terri Daniel. You can find me at deathgriefandbelief.com. We have 2 conferences online every year. We have the conference on death, grief, and belief in the summer, and we have the symposium on death and bereavement studies every winter. So come find us and come join us. Thank you.